First and foremost, I'd like to welcome our wonderful man, Uncle Brian Hunt, a Barkinjim elder, who is going to give us an acknowledgement of country. Thank you, Uncle Brian.
Well, a very good evening, folks. It's really wonderful to be with you here this evening. Now, my name is Brian Hunt, and as an elder of our local Barkinjim community, I respectfully acknowledge all elders past and present of the Lachi people, who of course occupied this part of our beautiful country for many, many thousands of years. And I do hope that you enjoy the time spent with us here this evening. I have composed a poem here about the Chaffey brothers. Brothers George and W.B. were both men of much high esteem, commissioned by the government to embark on a massive scheme to develop irrigation by using the Murray River, already at their disposal, meant in time they could deliver. They had designed pumping engines that the Tangi company made. It was such an important role that the English company played. All their pumping was successful, though their plans had been debated. Plantations had quickly flourished on the land they irrigated. Of the channels they constructed, more than 100 miles were made that serviced the entire district, growing produce and trees for shade. They had established Mildura, developing irrigation. It was a first for the district and very first for our nation. All the streets had been numbered and the avenues had been named. Many of the intersections by a roundabout have been framed. On 9th Street, Deacon Avenue, the statue is W.B. His home was the Rio Vista, high above the river to sea. In the year 1985, a new bridge had been constructed to replace the very old one that had become rust-encrusted. It has been named George Chaffey Bridge for crossing the River Murray. Whether you're coming or going, may you never need to hurry. There are a lot of special sights to be seen on the Chaffey Trail, so bring along your camera and take some photos without fail. The signing of the indenture on the 31st day of May, done in 1887, is still celebrated today. These two Canadian brothers are both fondly remembered still for their marvellous achievements, ingenuity and their skill. The Chaffey brothers. Thank you.
He really is an absolute legend, isn't he? Fantastic. Yesterday we were down at the ABC studios and he recited that on air, and the announcer asked him about his stay in Mildura and how long and his history, and he just rattled off a poem about his history and his life just off the cuff. Absolutely fabulous. So we're really indebted to you, Uncle Brian, for coming along this evening. Really are. Thank you. And he always refers to me as George. That'll come a little bit later on. Unfortunately, our mayor couldn't be here this evening, but we do have a fabulous person to take his place, and it's Councillor Helen Healy. Thank you, Helen, for the welcome.
You all know Mark is the Deputy Mayor, but maybe that's one too many hats for him to wear tonight. Thank you, Uncle Brian, for that really thoughtful poem, and you're welcome to all of us here tonight. And I also acknowledge the traditional owners of the country that we live, work and play on, and their care for thousands and thousands of years of this land and the sharing of the country with us. I also express my sorrow for the ongoing impact and cost of that sharing. Tonight, in the spirit of acknowledging the traditional owners and anchoring us to the intent of the evening, I pay homage to thousands of years of passing on of culture, tradition, connection and belonging through creating and keeping and sharing the stories and the songs that tell us who we are and help us shape who we might be. I also acknowledge the effort and the journey you've all made to be here tonight and your journey into your future role as a good ancestor. And I'm delighted to welcome visitors and locals into the room. I see many familiar faces and a lot of unfamiliar faces, so you're all very, very welcome on behalf of Mildura Rural City Council. This festival offers a glimpse into the rich past and diverse narratives that helped shape our community and the chance to reflect on Mildura's remarkable heritage. Over the course of this weekend, attendees have the opportunity to explore the vibrant history and the stories that make Mildura and its surroundings so special. The experiences on offer during the festival speak volumes about our town's unique history and it going back tens of thousands of years. Tonight, we're honoured to be joined by esteemed presenters, who I'm sure Mark will be introducing later on, who will shed light on various aspects of our past and a deeper understanding of our region. I thank them for providing us with their talent, their expertise, their passion and their professionalism. I extend a sincere thank you to the Chaffey Trail Reference Group, my fellow councillor, Mark Eckel, who is the president, the secretary, Julie Jewell. Where are you, Julie? There you go, up there. And the treasurer, Barbie Cornell, who is actually one of our living treasures. Well done, Barbie. Thank you so much. The work Barbie does is incredible. And all the committee members for their unwavering commitment to preserving and sharing Mildura's colonial historical significance and increasingly exploring and acknowledging the deep history that is so important to understanding who we are. Their dedication ensures that both locals and visitors have an opportunity to explore the long, long history of our unique community. I wish you all the best for a really enjoyable weekend. Thank you and welcome.
Thank you, Helen. Beautifully presented as usual. The opening this evening was very, very important to us as the Chaffey Trail Reference Group, or Chaffey Trail Incorporated as we are now. Our Indigenous past is a very, very important component to the storytelling, and we hope for future years to look into that further and have it and have that engagement. The Chaffey Trail members, as passionate as we are, regard ourselves fortunate to be the custodians of a vision which continues to unfold. And isn't that the nature of history? We are here tonight to continue exploring and to discover and celebrate our journey so far. So let me introduce our learned friends, and I'll do that as they come up to present. And by doing so, I believe they are going to uncover the layers of our settlement over those years. The first I have for you tonight, and I'm so pleased to introduce Ken Orchard to you. Tonight's address will explore some of the ways in which photography was harnessed by the Chaffey brothers by referencing 3 significant photographic collections surviving in the Sunraysia district. It will also bring into sharper focus the valuable pictorial record of progress made in the Mildura irrigation colony in those early years by highlighting the pictorial inventiveness of the photographers. Baker and Farquhar from Melbourne, J.W. Lint from Melbourne, E.E. Oswald from Mildura, whose work taken together has left subsequent generations a unique visual legacy. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Ken Orchard.
It's delightful to be here tonight. I owe a big thank you to Deputy Mayor Mark Eckel for being here, and to Michelle Woodhouse, who's organised strenuously behind the scenes for quite a few months, I believe. I'd also like to thank Barbie Cornell from the District Historical Society, Lucy Marcuso, Janae Connell and Antoinette Zima from the Mildura Arts Centre, and the Thompson family, all here in Mildura, who assisted with the supply of some of the material that you'll see tonight. To Bernadette and Richard Wells, of the Mooraboon Historical Society, Bob Walton and Helen Petchell, from Redcliffe's Historical Society, and Ross Lake and Ian McWilliams. Thank you all for helping me with inquiries and being with me on the journey for the last couple of months since I came up here late last year. You've all helped to quicken my pace. Finally, I'd like to thank my loyal friends of 30 years, Alison and Max Whiting, and say a big thank you for your continued friendship, and I'm only sorry that Max can't be here tonight. You'll know where you are in this image on the screen. It's an image that's very familiar to all of you, I'm sure. It's been reproduced for nearly 100 years. It was first reproduced, and it shows Deakin Avenue. I'll be talking about this photograph a bit later on. But tonight, there are 3 groups of photographs I'd like to talk about, and I'll just elaborate a little bit on the technology that the photographers were using. Baker and Farquhar, as you heard from Mark, from Melbourne, Lint from Melbourne as well, although he had been in Grafton before that for 13 years. He arrived in Melbourne in 1876, and had a very successful career there. And he was given a number of important commissions over his career before he left Melbourne for the Dandenong Ranges in 1895. One of the important commissions was the one he did for the Chaffey brothers here in Mildura. The third photographer, who you'll all know about because the Historical Society, the Mildura Historical Society, published a book on his work in 2000, Ernest Oswald, was active in this township for 3 years, and which contrasts with the other photographers who were only here for very short periods of time. So he captured something quite different in flavour to what the other photographers did. You can see there at the top two dates, 1888, very early 1888, and then middle of June 1889. They were the 2 visits by Baker and Farquhar. There was actually another pair of photographers who came from South Australia under commission to the Chaffeys, who came up to Renmark and Mildura, but that's another story that's going to complicate the text, so I won't go in that direction. Lint came up for 10 days in November and December of 1889, and all of these photographers were using a dry plate process, so it's important to understand that all of these photographers worked in a new way as of 1880, because that was the year in which the dry plate process was introduced to Australia. Previously, these photographers, particularly Lint, was using a wet plate process, which meant that the photographers had to travel out into the landscape or stay in their studios and put chemicals on their glass plates to sensitise the glass plates, let them dry a little bit, settle them into their dark slides, put the dark slides in the camera, and then make the exposure. Before the chemistry completely dried, they then had to take that glass slide out in a dark room situation and develop it on the spot. Couldn't be done any other way. So the whole process of negative production was transformed in 1880 and thereon by the introduction of the dry plate process, where the plates were, in the first instance, imported to Australia. So some were manufactured here eventually in the 1880s, and they came pre-packaged, and the chemistry was already on the plate. So that meant that the photographers could travel out in the field with a box of glass dry plates, put those dried plates in the camera, and take the dark slides out and expose those plates, and then put them away in the same box, knowing what sort of exposures they were going to make, and then develop them a week later, a day later, and so on. So there was very much a transformation in the way they were operating in the field. So the dry plate process freed a lot of people up when they were making these images that you'll see tonight. The first of the photographers, Baker and Farquhar, came up here with a very good plate camera, and they're in 2 albums that I know of. They were a Melbourne firm. Some of their photography was of the city in Melbourne, so they were architectural photographers as well, but they were printing their works on letterpress cardboard and then mounting them in albums. And you can see in this image here of the patriarch gum which stood on the banks of the Murray, not very far from here, down towards the bridge. It was burnt down in 1966, and it was reputed to be probably the oldest or biggest tree on the Murray in the mid-Murray area here. So it was a very noteworthy subject for a photograph at that time, when talking about 1888 in this instance. You can see the letterpress on the bottom of the image here with their name as well, and some of these photographs are dated, which makes it very helpful for historically minded people to know when and where and how. The second photographer, Lint, as I said, came here for 10 days, and he had a very good studio in Melbourne. He made, we don't even know how many pictures he made, but he made probably at least 30, if not more. And they are in a version of slides as well as prints. This is a print of a ploughing machine just down, not far from the entrance to the Mildura Engineering Works behind the viewer. And up on the hill is Peter McLaren's home. And the third photographer, Oswald, he was someone who was, I'd describe his work as a kind of having a vernacular quality to it. He was very much involved in the everyday. He had a different lens to the other photographers. His work wasn't as sophisticated visually as the other two photographers. Often you get in his works the subjects being pushed a long way back to the horizon, but the details of his work are fascinating. In this particular one, you're looking across the back garden of the Chaffey brothers' offices to their toilet block and their garden, probably some veggie gardens down in there too. So he wasn't didn't care too much about seeing the kind of the backyard view of Mildura through the 3-year period that he was working. But before we go too far into their works, I'd just take there are 2 digressions in this presentation, and one is, so I was told a few weeks ago that I'd produced a PowerPoint. I had 50 slides, 45 slides or something, and they said, don't do any more than that, you'll put people to sleep. And so I pruned it right down. I had about 50 or 60, but now I've got 80, so there's a few to get through. But this particular image took my eye when I visited Barbie Cornell only a few months ago in Langtree Hall, which I visited many years ago when Thea, her mother, was still alive. And this was an image that I saw hanging as a photocopy on the side wall of the museum when I went in there. And I immediately gasped, because this photograph, I think, speaks volumes about the use of photography at this time, both as a medium of social dimension and also a marker of time and a record of circumstance, and I'll talk about that now. There are 4 people in the photo, as you can see. It came into the Historical Society's collection in 1963, gifted by W.B. Chaffey's son, W.H. Chaffey. And you can see at the bottom, as well as the names, Peter McLaren, Conrad Gordon, W. Valentine and S. Whiteman, that it was taken in Echuca, not Mildura, after the loading of the barge Premier in 1888. So it's a very early photograph. But there was something about it that really fascinated me. I was interested in the photograph particularly because as soon as I saw it, I recognised Peter McLaren, and he's an important figure in the early time of Mildura. He was the chief engineer for the Chaffeys, and he had jurisdiction over the Mildura Engineering Works, which was down here on the banks of the river, not far from where we're sitting. But this particular photograph triggered a memory that I had about a viewing of a group of photographs by the former editor of the Cultivator in 1919 with a Mildura resident, and they discussed various photographs, and this was one amongst them. not this photograph, this moment that's described here, the arrival of the traction engines, Ballarat and Sarah, in charge of W. Valentine, the man in the photograph. And 30 years after that moment that he's describing, 1888, he was still here working the pumping station in town, so 30 years of work. And he'd come out from England to be in charge of the McLaren engines, and they had an exhibition of the engines at the Royal Show in Melbourne in that year. And they also then were taken up to Torrumbarry near Echuca, and a demonstration was done. And then those two engines were placed on a barge, the Premier, and it was towed by the Pride of Murray, which is a steamship, down to Mildura. And he was accompanied by a big group of men, and the arrival was actually 7th of October 1887, not 1888. And the first thing they did was to clear Deakin Avenue, as you can see. And William Valentine, there is a photograph of Valentine in the Oswald album, his family home and his children. But to see him together with these other individuals struck me as such a powerful capture of time of this moment. So these men have just loaded the barge, probably with some planks. They wouldn't have craned it onto the barge. Successfully got these two probably 1 tonne, 2 tonne machines on the barge, and then they've decided, instead of going down to the pub for beer, they've decided to go into the photography studio and make a memorial photograph of the moment. They're proud that they've done that, and then within probably days they would have gone with the barge and the Pride of Murray down to Mildura and unloaded those. So they started work about 2 weeks later. So this is the very moment of the beginning of the colony from a engineering point of view. And the first thing they did was to clear Deakin Avenue. And Oswald photographed this from the top of the Williams store, which was a general store between 8th and 9th Street. 9th Street is that intersection cutting across the foreground, the mid-ground there. The sort of thing they would be using was the traction engine like this. This is a Baker and Farquhar photo. A detail. I don't know which machine it is, but that's by the by. And the Baker and Farquhar record is very, very rich. There are 2 albums in private collection, and the kind of images you see in the albums are landscape views. So this is from the New South Wales side, looking across to what was to become Mildura. There's nothing there. It's just an empty field. And within 18 months, it looked like that. So their time capsule in the album gives a really amazing record of the efforts and the speed at which things were going on in the field of Mildura. Baker and Farquhar are an important contributor to the Red Book, which you'll all be familiar with. And I've read a little bit about the Red Book and so on through the sort of Hansard of the Mildura cultivator. And there were lots of criticisms and so forth based upon what people were promised and what actually happened on the ground, but we won't go into that tonight. We'll wait for Stuart's book. But importantly, they produced a series of topographic etchings, is what they call them, from the Baker and Farquhar photographs, which were then reproduced in a reprographic process in the Red Book. There were quite a few other artists involved, photographers who contributed to the Red Book as well, including Needham, the artist who did the sketches for the lithographs that occur in the book, but also Sydney photographers, Carey and Jones, Tuttle and Sweet from Adelaide, Nicholas Kerr from Melbourne, along with Hart and Walker from Melbourne. So the Chaffeys drew in all sorts of things, including a photograph which is not acknowledged in the Red Book by Charles Bayliss, who was in the New South Wales Lynn Commission, which came down the Darling in 1886, and also pictures by H.J. Johnston, the artist. He ran a photo studio in Melbourne. He was quite a prominent artist at that time as well. So it's a kind of cornucopia of imagery in the Red Book. For those of you, and I'm sure you all are interested in the Mildura homestead history, this is probably, it's not the earliest photograph of the homestead that I know of. The one that I do know of, which I thought I wouldn't confuse things tonight, is by George Burnell, taken in 1862, roughly from the same position, but using a much inferior camera than the camera that Baker and Farquhar were using. And this is the detail of the old homestead, 1880, I'd say early 1888, and this beautifully constructed stone building to the left of it. They titled many of their photographs, not all of them though, and in fact in the Baker and Farquhar albums there are a series of lint photographs as well, which adds confusion to the story. And so these albums are a construction by the Chaffey brothers, having received the material from different photographers, and then they've compiled them together and haven't attributed the imagery to the artist concerned who made the pictures. So it just adds an extra layer of complexity. I think this is a wonderful picture to have here tonight, given the words that Mark has just indicated, because as far as I know, you can always be knowing more, of course, in these things. This is the earliest photograph of the Mondeleman site that we know today as that, after all the work that was done by people from Melbourne, the Royal Society, the Mildura Arts Centre put the wonderful exhibition on in 2007, and then there was a symposium about the Blandowski and Kreft Natural History Survey. This particular shot's taken from, of course, New South Wales side, and it shows clearly the cliffs, the white cliffs that we previously known as Chaffey's Landing. Very, very beautifully taken, and also very rich textures, superb printing in these albums. What's fascinating about the album, one of the albums, is that it's got this inscription, River Murray Views, Richard Tangi, Esquire, with compliments, Chaffey Brothers Limited. And of course you all associate Tangi with the Tangi pump, which is just down behind us, one of them. And he was famous 30 years before he got to Mildura in 1890. He came to see the pump commissioned in January of 1890 here in Mildura, but he'd been tangled up with one of the great mid-Victorian engineering feats in 1857-58 when they launched the Great Eastern. And these photographs are taken by Robert Howlett, who was a young photographer who was commissioned to record this feat of engineering. One of the problems that they had here was that they built this massive 200-metre long ship on the banks of the Thames at the Isle of Dogs, which is now opposite Greenwich, and it's covered with high-rise buildings. But they had this area to build this Leviathan in fact it was called the Leviathan before they decided to change its name to the Great Eastern, because east it was to go. And this ship in 1866 laid the transatlantic cable, which revolutionised communications in the world at that time. Isambard Brunel, who was the architect for the boat, is captured in this famous photograph at the chain block. But for our purposes tonight, it's great to have encountered a slide, a lantern slide in the Melbourne collection, which was left by the Tangi Brothers Company here in Melbourne, ended up in the library, which indicates that the figure here at the Isle of Dogs is Richard Tangi as a very young man. And he always maintained, along with his brothers, that we launched the Great Eastern, and the Great Eastern launched us. He became a very prominent person in engineering globally at the company, and the reason that he was involved here was that he designed, his brothers designed a hydraulic ram system, and this is one of the hydraulic rams that pushed that boat sideways, inch by inch, into the river. That's the only way they could do it. So they came up with this a billet of solid steel that then was used to slowly creep the boat into the river. So the scale of production here of the Tangis can't be underestimated. And when George Chaffey, as you'll all know, designed his own engine and then gave it to the Tangi company to make, they weren't prepared to put their name on it, even though their name is lower on the plate. They were calling it the Chaffeys because they weren't too sure whether it was going to be efficacious enough for the job at hand here in Mildura to pump the water. And this brings us to a picture which you'll all be familiar with. It's been reproduced many times, I think prominently in Sid Wells's book of the interior view by Lint, who was a master of light, control of light in these low light conditions, as you'll see later on. But this image is of the interior of the Billabong pump. So what you're looking at here, in part, is the machine that's still down on the riverbank here. So at this point, I'm not too sure whether it's been commissioned, but when Tangi came to Mildura in January of 1889, he went to see this pump in operation, and if not, he watched it being commissioned to be put into pump operation. They were running it and testing it, and then they had to get it to pump the water. And this is the sort of beginning of the Lint section. I've put a detail here of the marks on the machinery. So this machinery left the wharves at Birmingham from the factory, came into Adelaide, transshipped onto the railway which ran along the dock at Port Adelaide, railed up to Morgan, transshipped across off the wharf onto paddle steamers and then brought up to Mildura. So it had a very long journey around the globe, this equipment. And it's important to understand about Lint that his commission involved two things. He first marketed his work in the Cultivator and in Melbourne, in the Argus, and he called his views that he took views of Mildura and around, and they were available by applying to William Neville, who was a storekeeper here in Mildura on Madden Avenue. This was his store. So you could walk into Mr. Neville's store and go through a list and order a picture of Lints, which were then orders sent to Melbourne, probably through that telegraph system, and then it would print them out and send them up. So he was making photographic prints. This is the photographer at two different times, 10 years apart. The first one on the left is more or less taken within months of his arrival in Melbourne, opening his studio in May of 1877. And he kept that studio open for nearly 20 years. And the second one is the frontispiece to a book that he published in 1887 in London, which was he was a British citizen. He took citizenship in the 1860s, and he was let's call him a royalist. He dedicated his book, Picturesque New Guinea, to Queen Victoria, and he then launched that book in the 1888 exhibition in Melbourne, the Centennial Exhibition, to great acclaim, and he was the commissioner for the New Guinea court, the room full of New Guinea objects and photographs and so on. So this particular picture shows him probably the height of his career 2 years before he came to Mildura. But what we know about Lint here in Mildura is predicated on the lantern slides, what we call the Lint lantern slides. And this is the original box they came in. And these will all be familiar too because they were recently shown at the Arts Centre late last year. And we have to thank the hard-working curators for that because they really did a fantastic job, not only of the show, but looking after the material, having all the materials scanned and beautifully framed. It was such a great display, and it was such a pleasure to be invited up at that time. So they've been in the collection a very long time. You'll all be familiar with Kay Valaire's book, which was published in 1985. It's when Lint's work, or 84 I think. There were two publications of Lint's work at this time. Kay Valaire's book here in Mildura in 84, and then in 85 Shah Jones's book on Lint in Melbourne. She was the state librarian in Melbourne at that time. And I just thought I'd show you a series of pictures that put the slides in a context of Lint at work in the field, because he did his negatives, he made these exposures, he then printed them as photographs, they ended up in albums, but he also, most importantly, made a series of lantern slides. The lantern slides are about that big, They're one sheet of glass with the emulsion on the inside and another sheet of glass backed onto that to protect the emulsion. And they were surrounded with a tape around the edge, and they were made for a very specific purpose. I'll just give you a detail here. I've done a few details because these images are so lovely to look at. I think this is one of the masterworks of any image of the Murray River in the 19th century, and he certainly had a lot of competition. I could list off a whole run of names. An image that comes to mind is Nicholas Care's photograph of the Echuca Wharf, which I think is a masterpiece, and Charles Baylis's series of pictures on the Darling and in the Lower Murray here in 1886. But Lint was a pictorialist. He had a real knack. It's not a great scan on the left-hand side, so sorry about that, but a real knack with creating compositions that allowed the viewer to comprehend what's going on in the photographs. So here's the kernel traction engine, 2 different shots, and the one in the Lint Lantern Slide set in the Mildura Arts Centre is this one, and this is the detail, of course, and it shows you him constructing a picture which is describing the relationship of stasis of the engine, which has got all the power here, and the swivel drive on the machine, which is grappling that great big root system out of the ground, just through the position of him in relation to those two objects. I think it's a fantastic image that is not just a recording, oh, here's the machine in the field. This is what that machine is doing. He's describing in a still image. Interestingly for me, when I look at this picture as well, is that many of his later pictures have an inscription on them. This one's called Mildura Steam, stump extractor at work. So he lettered these on some of his slides as well. Sometime in the late 1880s, he catalogued all of his work for many years. Prior to that, he'd been working for by the time he came to Mildura, he'd been at work for about 30 years. And he had a mentor in Conrad Wagner, who became his father-in-law and took over the business in Grafton in 1868. So that's when he started as a sole operator in 1868. So this is about 20 years later. A view of the outside of that pumping station, the Billabong pumping station. Lantern slide and print. The print on the left is not attributed to Lint in any way in the Baker and Farquhar album. And a detail of that construction. And I thought I'd put this in for you, just give an idea of what it looked like from the back. This is an Oswald picture, and you can see the pumping works up to the flume, which was carrying the water away from that pumping station. There's so much to choose from in this presentation. I could give you 200 pictures, but we don't have the time. The emergence of the lantern slides happened in 1983 with the gifting to the centre by the daughter of the Chaffey secretary. So Frederick Kilburn was the secretary working for the Chaffeys. He looked after this series of slides for decades, and then his daughter, Miss Doris Kilburn, gave them to the Art Centre in 1983. So they'd stayed with the Kilburns for about 90 years. And then it took some time to, having done the report in 2019, I'd become aware of them a long time before that, in fact, but my mental landscape was in the 1860s and 70s period, and I wasn't interested in necessarily the Chaffey story at that time, so they weren't so interesting for me, but I was certainly aware of them. And then came the sense of, well, what were they about? So I started exploring that once I had done the survey on them, and they were actually made for the Chaffey brothers, but they were made for a man by the name of William Herbert Jones. He's here in this photograph. So this is a departure photograph, I think. So it shows Lint constructing the picture again, inviting his sitters to sit where he wants them to sit. They're all about to get on the boat with him to go back to Swan Hill and back to Melbourne. There are 2 real estate agents in this group. One of the real estate agents' wife, Mrs. Boyden. Mr. Boyden's on the right-hand side. Haynes, the other land agent, sitting in the middle, and the man behind is William Herbert Jones. It's called Ruby at the Landing Place. There was no wharf in those days, of course. And he was a very important figure later on, involved in all sorts of things with doing lectures in a global context. And he was commissioned by Chaffey to do a series of lecture tours. And one of his lecture tours I found a record of, which shows him in North England, in the Newcastle area, giving a talk about 18 months, 2 years after he was here in Mildura. And he had as you can see at the bottom there, he was an authority on Australasia generally. He'd spent time in New Zealand, spent time in Ballarat. He was a Wesleyan minister, and he had a huge collection of lantern slides which he could illustrate his public lectures, a bit like we're doing tonight. So there's a nice kind of synergy there for me. His career is not that well known. He died in 1935, and just coming back to that slide, he's most well known for his establishment of the British Israel Foundation, or World Federation, in 1919 after the war. And he gave a lot of money to good causes, and he left a large collection of his library to the World Federation. So at this stage he's about 30 in Mildura, and he travels around with Lint. He was on the boat with Lint up to Mildura, and then departing from Mildura as well. Captain Meyer was the captain of this boat. He was famous for always looking after his passengers very well, especially in summertime. He'd load on billets of ice for travelling backwards and forwards. Captain Meyer was also a landholder here in Mildura in the early days, halfway up Deakin Avenue. I've always been intrigued by this photograph. I own an original copy of this picture. It's just one of those iconic pictures, and it's even entered the sort of popular imagination by people making versions of this picture in tapestry form and so on. I picked this up in a junk shop on my last trip back from Mildura. I couldn't believe it. I knew what I was looking at straight away, except for the fact that one of the men in the image has been transferred into a woman. So there are 2 men and 2 women in the tapestry. Coming to the point that I made earlier about lint and light control, the slide in the Centres collection, the image on the same image on the left in the State Library collection, is his interior shots. This is one of them. This is the interior of the workshop, and it's just a fabulous composition. I did have a slide here before of Tom Roberts shearing at Newstead, which we call the Golden Fleece. I'm sorry I deleted it now, otherwise I could have made that point, but it's very much a pictorial picture. He's again staged managed this moment in time. And here's a detail of Peter McLaren with one of his co-workers. This is either Arthur Wheatcroft or E.W. Anderson, I can't tell which is which. So the man over here on the far left, just in the black suit, either of these men are either of those 2 names, so we might find out the answer to that one day. The second image just outside the workshop is this wonderful picture called Mildura Notables. You'll see in your program tonight a request for more information, please, if you can possibly put your mind to spreading the word within the community here, because there's a series of names that were put to this photograph, but there was no key at that time in 19 when it was described to say which person was which. But the names are given in the program, and many prominent people are in this particular photograph. When Shah Jones published this picture in her book on lint in 1985, she said that George and W.B. Chaffey are the 2 men sitting in the foreground in the middle, but they're not. They're not described in the list, and looking carefully at the picture, I have to dissuade you from thinking that from here on in. We do know who some of the people are, and I'll talk about that in a minute, but one of the things that, just about coming into this idea of craftsmanship and visuality in Lint's work, he was very, very good at corralling people, creating these sets for a camera for a particular shot. He's just got one shot. He's not click, 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 click. He's taking one shot. So he's constructing these pictures and telling people exactly where he wants them and calming them down. And he did this incredibly when he was at the capture of the Kelly gang, or the demise of the Kelly gang and the capture of Ned Kelly at Glenrowan in 1880 in June. He got, these are aftermath photographs, so that the day after the conflagration of the Glenrowan Hotel, he was commissioned by the newspaper to travel there. He took 6 photographs, wet plate, and he, in that circumstance, people running everywhere and so on, you can imagine, he took a series of incredible pictures. I'm just going to show you 2 to make the point. This is outside the Benalla lockup where Kelly had been incarcerated overnight. He's no longer in that lockup. He's been, just prior to this picture, he's been taken to the train station and taken to Melbourne. But it's also the lockup where Joe Byrne's body was kept overnight. So this is a morning photograph, the following morning, and all the police force that were involved in the fracas. He also managed to go back, which comes first I don't know, to go back to the site of the capture of Ned Kelly. This is Kelly's tree here, and all the people that were held in the Glenrowan Hotel over a whole night time with guns going off and so on. He invited them all to come together for a group photo, again, highly constructed. So coming to our picture here of him working with the Mildura notables, you remember that early on a picture of the plough outside the doorway of the workshop? Well, they're all piled up over this machine. You can see it, the wheel in the back there where the figures are standing on. So he's used a mechanical device to get the elevation in the group. And recently I was reading George Chaffey's life story, Alexander's book from 1928, and I discovered in there a bingo moment because there was a portrait of Nathaniel Mackay, which confirmed for me the man on the left here. This is Mackay, who's the editor of the newspaper here in Mildura, and he was the kind of mouthpiece for the Chaffeys, effectively. So reading the cultivators of amazing experience. The amount of detail and the amount of things that are going on from day to day in that paper is incredible. The man in the middle, of course, Lord Ranfurly. There are 8 people that I could name in the photograph, but I won't go in all that detail, but just three of the key players. And it's important that, again, understanding Lint's psychology, he has the Mildura editor newspaper of the newspaper sitting closest to the camera. He's got Peter McLaren, who's in charge of the workshop at the apex of this triangle that he's constructed, and he's got the VIPs in the front. Dr. Abramowski's there in the shirt between the 2 men in the middle of the photograph at the front with the beard and the hat, and Carter, Constable Carter's over on the far right, just out of this view. So all the names are in that list there, so you can ponder them at your leisure. The last photograph I'll show you about that Lint took, which occurs in no other place than in the Baker and Firequire album, so it's quite likely unique. It's about this big. Is a picture again at the landing place from the Ruby this time, not of the Ruby, and you can see in it 2 craft. The one in the background is the Ellen, like the Ruby, also electrified with electric light. The Chaffeys electrified all 4 of their boats, and when the Ruby came down river from Swan Hill on its maiden voyage, having been electrified, the whole township of Euston lined up on the bank to watch it go by. It was such an important moment for them. So this idea of Chaffey and technology, know-how, was expressed through not only the telecommunications between their office and the coffee palace and the workshop and so on around town, but on their boats. This is such an interesting photograph from the point of view of the sandbagging that you can see up there near the buildings. The buildings are the actual driving force of the Mildura Engineering Workshop, which is hidden behind the trees. And the little building under the gum trees, so to speak, in the middle of the 2 buildings is the first of the offices of the Mildura cultivator. Again, a huge amount of wood being piled on here into these boats to keep them going, and the Orient, which is the name of the boat in the foreground, had such a slight draft that it had the competition on the river. It ran the service between here in Wentworth in its day, and at Low River it was one of the very few boats that could keep running. Captain Cantwell was the captain of the boat. But the most important thing about this picture is this detail here. You can see the electric light globe hanging there over these gents' heads, just giving you an idea about this, what the camera captures by chance in a way. But here, because I've been following Lent's story for such a long time, about 30 years now, he can't hide from me. And there he is with his boater. He's put himself into the shot. He does this a number of times over his life in these kind of critical moments, and he's inscribing himself into the moment of this early record of Mildura, which has just commenced. So he's very aware of the historic moment. The man with him with his notebook is the man commissioned by Chaffey by the Chaffeys to go on his world tour doing lectures. And you can see his notebook in his pocket, so it was probably full of notes. Wouldn't you love to read what was in there? But seeing this photograph for the first time about 6 years ago, I was just so thrilled because it shows Lent the only time he ever shaved. He always wore a beard. This is a post-marriage photograph, so his second wife probably insisted that he was clean-shaven, and it's the only one I've ever seen of him with just a moustache. He quickly grew it back. The last album, I've got about 2 minutes to go. The last album is the Gregory album, or the Oswald album, I should say, but you can see the name G.J. Gregory here on the title page. George James Gregory, sorry. A very modest album, but full of more than 120 pictures, which many of you will be familiar with. What's so interesting about the album is that it's a record of the relationship, friendship between Oswald and this man, who looked after the album with his family since 1890 until it was gifted to the Mildura Historical Society in 1962. So for 70 years they looked after this document. And he came out from London. He was from Lambeth in London, and he was a cabinet maker for Rio Vista. I believe somewhere I've read that he was involved with the building of the stairway in Rio Vista. So when Bob Walton tomorrow takes us on a round in Rio Vista, I think we might touch on Gregory again, perhaps. What's lovely about these two photographs of Gregory, this is the other one of him in the tent now, is that it shows this idea of a bit like that moment with the men having loaded the barge, going to the studio, having their photograph taken. It becomes a sort of social document, capture a moment. Here's a man who's gone to the other side of the world. His wife's to follow, but here's all of his family effects. He's basically brought his whole family with him, his aunts and uncles, maybe his brothers and sisters, including his parents, all constructed in the picture by him and Oswald. It's a still life in the back of his tent. But the most interesting thing about this photograph is the fact that it triangulates the distance between the coffee palace and the Chaffey offices in the top right corner down to the tent, because you wouldn't know where it was otherwise, which means to say that he's a step up the hill to his site of work, which is Rio Vista. So he's just below Rio Vista Bank here. The photographer, Oswald, as you'll all know, died tragically in a fire here in Mildura in 1892. But over those years, 3 years or so, he made all sorts of photographs. I bet there are many photographs of his out in the community still, because he ran a portrait studio. But we know him for his landscape photographs, of course, through the album. As I said before, a kind of a vernacular view, things at distance because of the equipment that he was using. But he captured so many interesting details. This is a detail of that shot of the view from the Coffee Palace down to the landing. So you were just previously down there with the gem. We're under those trees, under these trees on the bank, just to kind of give you the orientation of that landing area. All the traction engines would have come up through this cutting that you can see in the foreground. But the most interesting thing about this photograph is the fact that it shows you the umbilical cord of Mildura's communication system with the rest of the world. There it is going up over the river into New South Wales. And it was a loop line they had constructed, which meant that it was going out to join a loop line to Wentworth, to Broken Hill, back to Sydney, and the Sydney message then went down to Echuca and down to Melbourne. So it did this huge loop off these cables. He had a penchant for aerial views, quite a few of his shots. There's 17 aerial views in the album. This one taken from the Chaffey office, looking down onto the Coffee Palace and over towards Gregory's camp. This one from the Coffee Palace, looking to the gardens of Chaffey's. This is one of those photographs that's been reproduced many times. You'll be all familiar with it. And a little detail for you, the lovely Chaffey fountain, still there. And just to finish now, 7 slides to go. I've run a little bit over time, sorry. But this image that you're all familiar with, reproduced in 1928 and then by Ernestine Hill in the early editions of her book, I think, in the 1930s, showing Deakin Avenue and the tram line space that was a kind of mimic of the Euclid Avenue in Ontario, California. It was supposed to kind of mimic this particular avenue that's proudly there today in Ontario in their first irrigation colony. And they had a wonderful tram, they call it the gravity tram. And I've often thought that the horse that pulled this tram up the hill and then got on the back of the tram and trundled down as a passenger should be named Isaac. It's a great picture of that in the early times, about 1890 would be. But it's a segue to this picture here, which is the Williams store that you saw before, that I mentioned. And this was, Henry Williams was the first Shire president. The first meeting of the Shire was in April of 1890 in the Chaffey offices. It then moved to this little building in the mid-ground, in the far distance, in the middle. That's the Shire office, post office on the left, and Williams store on the right. So you can see the orientation of all those buildings around Deakin Avenue. And you can see that it's rained a lot. There's a lot of water on the ground. That's what that sheening is. But closely looking at these pictures in the lead up to do the talk, I asked Barbie for scans of these pictures, and it meant that I could cross-match them, and I suddenly realised what I was looking at, the very first panorama ever taken of Mildura, July 1890, beating by 2 years another very prominent panorama in 7 sequences. The post office, looking to Madden Avenue, looking across Deakin Avenue to the Shire office in the foreground. So Henry Williams didn't have far to go to his meetings. In the background, the Mackay brothers. There were 3 brothers, the cultivator, editor, H.V. Mackay, who was famous for the construction of the Sunshine Harvester, and another brother who ran this store. Looking up Deakin Avenue now, you can orient yourself here easily, 9th Street. Looking across, swinging around to clockwise, Abramowski's surgery there on the corner. And then a view across Langtree Avenue to the building in the centre, which is Langtree Hall, where we'll all be tomorrow night. And the corner of 8th Street and Langtree. And then this particular view here, which shows you looking back towards the river with the Coffee Palace in the far background and the Chaffey office. And I just thought I'll hold you there. I'll finish on that note. Thank you very much.